So just to give you a quick introduction, Jen Hadfield Storm Pegs gives us a glimpse into her life as a poet in the Shetland Islands. My memoir, Holler, tells of my military childhood in the South. To give you a little bit more about Jen, if you haven't already heard about her from this week's events, across 4 collections of poetry, Jen Hadfield's work expresses intense grief at the damage that humanity has done to the environment, as well as the profound joy that can be found in transcending the scale of the human. Hadfield's second collection, No Place, received the T.S. Eliot Prize, making her the youngest ever winner of that prize. Written in English, shot through with Shetlandic and Scots dialect phrases and words, the poems in No Place bring us into a world of mist and pine, down into the soil's dark meat, showing us that the closer we look, the further we can see. She's won many, many awards, including the Windham-Campbell, but I know you all want to hear from her directly. So without further ado, here is Jen, and you know, we have a short description here of Storm Pegs that it gives us a glimpse into your life as a poet in the Shetland Islands. Is that how you describe it, or how do you imagine it as a book?
How I imagine this as a book is a movable feast for me. Because it's been through so many incarnations in the editing and the writing. And it took me a very long time to write it. My publishers were extremely patient and endured a lot of drafts, some of which were extremely baggy. I think the first draft that I showed the publisher of this book was 200,000 words long, at which point they came back to me and said, we really need you to get this to 70,000 words. And I thought, I'm going to have to take out everything that is dear to my heart. So yeah, it's been through many incarnations. There are things that we'll maybe speak about later in terms of genre and some interesting tensions, interesting for me at least there. And I might talk about that in a wee while.
Yeah, maybe you could start by reading a passage that feels to you illustrative of the book.
Something that might give you a sense of what I was trying to do. So I have an opening essay or chapter, we'll maybe come back to the words essay and chapter later on. The title of this essay is Erts, and each of these essays has a Shetland word for the title. Can I just ask you before we go too much further, do you know where Shetland is? Not pretty much. It's almost halfway to Norway if you leave from, depending which bit of Scotland you leave from. But if you imagine an island where 23,000 people live, sort of halfway between Scotland and Norway, a 14-hour ferry journey. That'll give you the sort of sense of the territory. So I'll read you a passage from this introductory essay called Erts. And Erts means maybe one of two things. There are a number of Shetland dictionaries, and there are these two definitions available. The direction of a supposed line from any point in the heavens to the beholder is the Ert, situated on a supposed line between the beholder and the horizon, the point whence the wind blows, a point of the heavens as delineated on the mariner's compass. But there also follows ert as a verb, to contend with, to argue in a captious manner, to strive after, to try to obtain. And both of those meanings pressed usefully on this essay for me. After living in Shetland for 17 years, I still feel as if what I know about my home is next to nothing. Surfaces and veils, gossip and story, the translation of experience out of the local language, the constant but enigmatic company of history, so that past and present, like the twin strands of yarn in a Fair Isle Gansey, constantly weave over and under each other. I live in a perpetual state of discovery, like sudden plunge pools of intimacy with places, people, creatures, as if we were co-steering, you and I, edging along a greasy black ledge of rock over hard green waves, looking for footholds, cheek by jowl to the wet face of the cliff. This is how it is when we move into another culture, another language, another landscape, another people's history. One night, for example, in late summer, Magni, one of my nearest neighbours, shows me how to bone out herring. Now, he says figuratively, how do we get to Texas from here? He pierces the plump pewter skin and curls his fingers around the long, loose internal organs to pull them out, cutting free the roe, laying it like a limp orange tropical flower on one side. He runs his thumbnail along the membrane under the arch of the cavity to pierce it, and rinses out the thick, blackish blood. He cuts off the head and tail and pokes around the end of the spine with his knife as you would delicately prise a splinter from your skin. Then he works his right thumb under the spine, peeling it from the soft flesh with the fingers of his left hand. It makes soft snicking sounds like tiny doors unlocking. He turns the fish and works his thumbs up the other side of the spine and lifts the whole thing clear, bristling with the long, fine, curved rib bones like whiskers. He sifts oatmeal over the butterflied fillet and fries it in an electric pan. First we eat the fried milts, a mouthful of something more buttery than cream, and the popcorn-textured roes. And then we put away the double fillets, 2 or 3, with toast and salt and cracked black pepper, with water, then a mug of good sachet coffee. We don't speak while we eat, although sometimes a smile and sigh. After I walk home, my hair and clothes smell of herring oil. I can hardly sleep for the burden of rich flesh in my stomach. At 3 or 4 in the morning, with a terrible herring-induced bellyache, I get up and put my big coat and boots on over my pajamas to walk down the road in the faint rain. There's enough light to see the wallabies at the outpost, where the Tasmanian flag is flying. We consider each other, they in their light rain-pearled fur, neat piri hands folded over their chests, reminding me for some reason of nuns. In the next enclosure, 2 towering emus pace slowly over to the fence, and I do a double take. Wallabies, emus, at how Shetland defies easy definition. And so I blink awake every morning, like a patient coming round from anaesthetic, and ask, bewildered, where am I? And I'll just pause there.
Thank you so much. So it's pretty clear that it's a poet's memoir. This is beautiful. We've chatted a bit about how folk give you a sense of where you are and what Shetland is for you. And I was really struck in that passage of this idea of sharing a meal where you don't say anything. And just the difference. We were at the Windham-Campbell dinner last night, different way than we live here. Can you say a bit more about how specific peoples, Shetlanders in particular, sort of helped you answer this question of where am I?
I can try. Magni, my neighbour, is someone that we see sometimes almost daily. He comes round to our house very often. He brings gifts of fish or an old sweater that he doesn't fit anymore, and he'll sit himself down in the kitchen and speak for a few hours, untroubled by interruption often. I really wanted this book, if possible, to feel like, to the reader, like living in Shetland really feels, and for that it required almost constant interruption by other people, and unpredictable conversations in passing places as you're driving to town or going to get petrol or whatever. And I was wrestling as well with the potential problem of appropriation and the fact that I was writing about a place that I didn't grow up in. And as I hint in that passage, that sense of a culture that really isn't my own, and a sense of a history that I'll never fully understand, probably. Shetland, as you'd expect, is a super complicated place with a long history of folk coming and going from all over the world, and the historical events that go along with that have made it a really complex people and place. So here I was, having the audacity to write about my home, and I didn't want this book to be, as Kathleen Jamie said about so many books of nature writing, to have that kind of lone, enraptured voice in a landscape that pretended that no one else lived there. So I thought, well, what's the alternative? But I'm not super fluent in the Shetland language as well, so how can other people speak in this book without me stealing voices or misrepresenting voice? My best effort, and the answer I arrived at, was to try and invite other people to speak through the book. And I had conversations with my friends and my neighbours, which I then dashed home and recorded as faithfully as I could, word for word, and then bounced back to them, sometimes immediately, sometimes a couple of years later, and said, is this how you would say this? Did I get anything wrong? Are you willing to give your permission to use your stories and to use your words, to use your perspective? And almost everyone said yes. So it was a sort of a practical difficulty, but also if you wrote about Shetland and omitted the folk, then you wouldn't be writing about Shetland, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you write so wonderfully about people in your book also. I've really enjoyed Ella and James in particular. I think they're one of my favourite parts of your book, the moments when they appeared in the narrative. Would you like to speak about that a little bit as well? Or?
Sure, and they're probably the most obvious folk in my book. And I was really impressed when you told me that about your process of how you decided to include things. It seems like such a loving and careful way of being responsible to the stories. And my book is primarily a memoir of my childhood, although I think it's a poet's memoir partly because it doesn't really adhere to much of a narrative, and calling it a poet's memoir allowed me to leave a lot of stuff out. When I tried to write a narrative from beginning to end, it's just so much dead prose, and I thought, I can't live with that. And it kind of started cohering around America's wars, because I grew up with my grandfather after my father died in a scuba diving accident in Okinawa, and my mother made the unusual decision to move in with his father, who had been the commandant of the Marine Corps during Vietnam. So I was kind of taken out of one situation with this grief, but just plunged into American history. And a lot of the book takes place at a house in Middle Tennessee. It's a house that was built in 1790 as a tavern at the edge of the western frontier. And James and Ella were, officially speaking, the caretakers there. And this passage is about them. James and Ella were what Papa called the salt of the earth, a phrase that was intended to spin their less attractive qualities as virtues and explain or justify our relation to them. They'd lived in the small house for 40 years or so. Great-granddad, Papa's father, had recruited them as both help and company after the death of his wife, Claire. Before they met great-granddad, James and Ella had been living in the bona fide shack that floated on a mud skid among the cattle troughs to the left of our property, where John Audrey, the farmer next door, boarded his field hands. In my time, only the most down-and-out, pot-bellied, dirt-faced Calibans had lived there, and it was impossible to imagine James and Ella in such circumstances, for they were almost like members of the family. Almost. When the weather was warm enough, they lived in the side bedroom of the big house, which had no insulation, moving to the small house when they needed heat or when we got to town each June. Then, at some point, they moved over there permanently, leaving behind only their deep freeze, which they kept stocked with walleye, cigarette cartons, and other provisions that we were meant to keep our hands off. They'd met at the county fair when James was working Old Man Farrell's farm and Ella was a cook at the Fairfield schoolhouse. He'd walked past her, carrying a brown bag bottle, and slurred, "Foller me, chicken, I'm full of corn." "I've been following him ever since," she'd conclude when telling this story, as if it were her life's only piece of luck. Their romance had occurred in an inconceivable past, where they rented cabins on a lake and caught the ferocious fanged fish that were mounted on boards above their couch, a time presumably before Ella's skin had withered into one concentric wrinkle, and she spent her days arthritically locked into a lawn chair, sucking down Winston's, drinking sweet tea made with sulfur water, and chewing her cud. Even in this state, Ella vowed to wring the neck of any hussy who looked sideways at James, and was convinced that plenty did, maybe because of the bumper sticker on his pickup that read, "I break for blondes, brunettes, and redheads." In belted work pants, a crushed cap, and mesh shoes, with his long filed fingernails pincered around a butt end, James was debonair in a way that no one could explain or deny, despite the fact that he was almost as awful looking as Ella. All of us, even Nana, were smitten with him, for he possessed that talent for mischief that's often irresistible to protected women. A staunch Marine Corps-style standard of safety and security ruled all of Papa's affairs, and therefore ours. James, on the other hand, liked things a little bit evil. My mornings were consumed by trying to make him laugh, nuzzling his grizzle stash, smashing my face into his collar's red root-cratered triangle, grappling his chin open to confirm the 6 count of his teeth until he hippo-chomped me without so much as smirking. I always wanted him on my team when we played croquet, for he was ruthless and wouldn't hesitate to one-handedly thwack his opponent's ball into the rotted meal of a tree stump or the riverbank's marshy holler, laughing like Jehoshaphat once he'd inflicted the damage, even if his opponent was only 7 years old.
A poet's memoir, another poet's memoir. And is it all right if I just say, it'd be really interesting to hear you speak a little bit more about how you found writing those characters, but what really comes to me is their complexity and their magnetism, the complexity of your relationships and the love that I think I perceive and I think I feel bouncing off that passage. But would you like to speak a little bit more about writing them, or?
Sure. It was an odd experience writing this book because it happened in so many layers. So there were the primal memories that kind of haunted and possessed me, and sort of like this one. This was one of the first pieces that I wrote in the book, and sort of came out almost as if exercised, you know? And with that came the memory of loving these people before I really had the capacity to judge them, or to know what their attitudes were, or to know what their bigotries were. I mean, you know, and really that's central to a lot of the distance that came between us. So the method I use throughout the book, but particularly with these characters, is then going back and attempting to feel those memories while layering what I know now on top of it. You know, of course, there's the reaction that we're all familiar with. You know, how do you deal with somebody who's problematic, as we say, but it becomes more complicated when the problematic person is somebody who you loved and who loved you, and it becomes a sort of negative capability. Two things are true at the same time. In the book, I try to find some kind of reconciliation between those.
I think that was so successful. Actually, that was the thing I kept thinking as I read. I can't believe she's pulled this off. It felt like you'd held the whole of a relationship and the whole of more than one person in a little thin book. And that's a poet's thing as well, maybe, I think. Yeah.
Well, that's a good segue, because that is, I think, one thing that's so fascinating about your book is how you look, how you perceive the world, and how just passionately you look out. And in many ways, you know, this is a book, a story of Shetland, and yet it's also a memoir. It's full of the most beautiful descriptions of the natural world, really inspired. I don't even want to say descriptions, because it's experiences of the natural world that are just embodied in your language, and then also other people. So there's a lot of other people. There's a lot of other life in your book, and not a whole lot of confession or autobiography. So I'm wondering about that choice. Is that a conscious choice? What does it say about you as the memoirist?
So this is where we get into speaking about genre a bit, I think, and there's a sort of I don't know if it's an awkward truth, which I'm happy to share with you. My project when I began writing this book was not to write a memoir, and I've heard so many writer colleagues say something similar, actually. Talk about a discomfort around describing their work as memoir. I began by wanting to write a series of intense, maybe slightly trippy micro-essays about my home, and I wanted them to feel like they existed in a perpetual present. And I wanted the reader to feel dizzyingly swept up in that place and that present tense. And for that to be happening within some super subjective experience of the Shetland that I've experienced. That's the book that I made a proposal for and sold to my publisher. And 3 changes of editor down the line, and after I'd squashed 130,000 words out of the big baggy horror story that was the first draft, my editor came back with their notes and said, "We really think this needs more of a narrative arc, and we'll be promoting this as memoir." And I felt an extreme resistance to that. And then I thought, well, I'll take on board that it's probably hard to follow, and it needs a structure that's working more successfully. The perpetual present thing that I was striving for really didn't work. I think it was confusing. I thought I'll try it. I put in lots, not lots, there was never lots, but a lot more autobiography, some useful patches which helped get people from why I moved to Shetland to why I was still there. And then I took about half of that out again and put in lots of the other stuff that I'd taken out before. And this kind of collaging has been happening for years now, you know. So my perspective as a poet, as a non-fiction writer, is always going to be to want to look outwards, because I'm not super interested in looking at myself in the place. I think Shetland is a far more interesting character than I am to myself. especially because it's so elusive and so hard to pin down. So the book is these two things, and there's been more than one review that has commented on how surprisingly little there is of me in it. But I would say that I wanted the Shetland that I wrote to be coloured by my lens, and I wanted it to be clearly super subjective, and I wasn't going to try and write a guidebook. I wouldn't do that very well, and there's a fantastic canon of Shetland literature already. So I try to maintain that kind of trippiness and that presentness, and to give Shetland centre stage in the book, which is how I experience it still. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if it feels at all like if not a story of the self, which is often how we think of a memoir, does it feel at all to you like a romance?
It is a romance. It will always be a romance. And there's a love story at the end of it, but the romance is with Shetland. Yeah. Shetland is the lover, and Shetland is the lover that's always slipping out of your grasp slightly, but is also incredibly, palpably inescapable. And I wanted to share the intimacy of my relationship with place, and I wanted it to be sensual, so that there are many descriptions of the several wild swimming descriptions. I know wild swimming's sort of quite cliched, and lots of people are writing about wild swimming. But I feel every time I swim in the sea in Shetland, which is a foolish, foolish thing to do, by the way. It's extremely cold. I feel every time I do that my concerns fall away, and my awareness of past and future fall away, and I experience a shocking presentness and a wonderful sensuality that make me feel closer to the creatures the wildlife and the creatures that I love in Shetland. So. It is sensual, if not sexual, in that way, I think. And I really wanted to share that too.
And did you say that you've been swimming since you've been here?
I have been swimming. on our first day, we went to, I think it's called Morris Cove, and the tide seemed very far out. I felt like I was wading in for a very long time, and still only up to about here. You know?
I was very impressed.
You've got a big tidal range, I think, here. Like in Shetland, it's so you're in deep fast in Shetland.
Well, you have a great passage where you write about Shetlandic's poetic playfulness. And you say that words in Shetlandic seem to have their own consciousness or soul, so that living there can feel like living in a subtly more animated world. So, you know, that describes the romance, but I felt that in some ways the book also acts as a kind of spiritual guide, or that was I guess I wondered how many people would read this book and think, oh, this is what I need to do. This is what's wrong with me, or this is what's wrong with America. I need to move to Shetland and, swim with bioluminescent jellyfish and, walk on cliffs. And what do you say to that reaction? And I won't say who had that reaction.
But that's so interesting, just as a question, I think. And I've been asked by more than one reviewer if I felt that people might move to Shetland on the strength of reading my book and then rapidly leave, which was also revealing and interesting, I think, for me. So I live in heaven, I live in a utopia, and I also live in a real industrialized, constantly changing, complex, tricky place. The really interesting thing for me about Shetland is that people like me and people unlike me are moving to Shetland all the time and not leaving. Like, we're moving there, and very, very many of us are staying for years and decades and whole lives, and some of our families are moving up, which is a not something I foresaw when I moved there. My sister moved up a few years ago, which is wonderful. My mum and dad are now looking at it, kind of in this, can we find somewhere to stay in Shetland? That was not the plan, but it's actually very wonderful. I think people feel that if you live in heaven, that that must be a thin heaven, and that it must tear, or it must pale, and surely reality must be returned to. Actually, it works in Shetland for a lot of people. I think, I'm not going to say everyone, you can't generalize like that. I don't know that many people who moved away for reasons other than pure practicality. You know, maybe my family took them back south, or a job moved them, or something like that. I think because we are both so far from the Scottish mainland and so much in the centre of all those sea roads, we have to be really self-sufficient. And up to this point, there's been a really rich and constantly evolving culture scene. There's been a really wide range of interesting and well-paid jobs for folk. The Shetland children have very often gone away to university, but then come back and made their lives back home again. So it doesn't have the same depopulation pattern as a lot of the other islands have done. And it's super outward looking, and it always has been, because that's how the culture of Shetland has been formed. And we're in the centre of the sea roads, you know, and the same is still true for wildlife. So it works as a place. The pace of change at the moment is something that's really startling me, though, and I can't predict what Shetland is going to be like in 5-10 years' time, because of some really substantial changes that have happened recently. So I'm curious to see.
Well, I want to be sure we get back to heaven before we leave, and we'll leave a little time at the end, and let me just keep my eye on the clock. But so that there's a passage that I'm hoping Jen will read at the end that kind of answers that question, where am I, in a really beautiful way. But I did want to ask something more about how poetry exists in Shetland. You mentioned that the arts are kind of dwindling, and so I love the poet George Mackay Brown, who's from Orkney, and his poems are kind of populated by fishermen and crofters and sailors, and they're the things in his poems are so incredibly thingy, and hard won, and seem washed up by the sea. I guess this is probably a romantic idea that somebody has from afar, but I wonder how poetry exists among people. Are poets hanging out with musicians and sailmakers, and because that obviously here, poets hang out with other poets in the Bainiki, so what's that difference, and is it sort of like an older idea of what poetry is, or I'm curious too just about how you make poetry there, but we'll get to that.
And can I also make a mental note to return to that house that you've begun to take us to, and to ask you what that place means spiritually to you. Maybe we'll move our way towards that as well, if that's okay. So this I'll try and make this answer not too big, but it's quite a big potential answer. I think not only do poets hang out with sailmakers and fishermen and crofters, but they are sailmakers, fishermen and crofters in Shetland, and there is such a respect for poetry there, which was something it took me a while to trust when I moved there, because I don't think it's quite what I grew up with, actually. I think that in the UK, the poetic culture is tricky. It's almost something I'd be a bit embarrassed to admit I did for a very long time. So this environment is really affirming for me. Obviously it would be, but it's different as well, I think. And maybe I'll read a really short passage about the Shetland language. Coming back to that is important for me, because that thinginess that you mentioned is really in the language. It almost feels like you're plugging into some essential current if you're listening to the local language, which has, by the way, not always been referred to as a language. It's still often referred to as Shetland dialect, but that would imply that it was a sort of a sub-something to English or to Scots, and it's much more Norse than that. And it's got its own sort of syntax and grammar, and this incredibly rich dying vocabulary. So maybe I can give you briefly a sense of what the language has meant to me. When A to P, this is one of Shetland's many dictionaries, when A to P fell into my hands, I felt I could suddenly, like a bee, see a brand new spectrum of colours. For a poet, heaven. At the same time, to read a word in a dictionary that had no definition was like watching a world grow grey and disappear before my eyes, a kind of extinction. Plumber, one of my friends and neighbours. Plumber. The other day, Elise came down and she told me a story. She said to me, Dad, there's a seagull tapping on the window. And I said, a what? And she said, a seagull. And I said, a ma. I've always said ma to her. What does it do to heart and soul and mind to watch the words disappearing which framed your whole world? Words for water in which food has been cooked, for the cry of a cow or other animal, for crying as if in pain, for a large stone wrought smooth by the action of the sea, for a lump or knot on woolen yarn, for the slight noise that water makes when it's nearly at boiling point, for barnacles on wood, for irregular sloping rocks, nearly flat, for a small quantity of anything, for being overpowered by heat, I'm skipping now, for making a grinding noise while eating, for a line about 20 fathoms long with light floating lead used when fishing's safe, for the mind wandering in old age, for a light passing shower, for a little pig which, lying near the fire for warmth and being disturbed, patters among the ashes running across the hearth, for a half sock, for large pieces of soft snow, for the movement of the arms when feeling for an object in the dark, to seek or feel for anything, making a sweeping movement with the arms. And these are all quotes from dictionaries. So I hope that maybe illustrates how poetry is in the daily language, and maybe gives you a sense of how palpable the language is, and how people are saying poetry all the time, but also doing that really consciously and celebrating it themselves, at the same time as seeing it disappear, because languages are so vulnerable to so many things, but particularly to ridicule and punishment, which is something that has happened a lot in the history of the Shetland dialect.
What was the one about the little pig again?
Oh, the little pig.
The little pig.
I sort of addressed
this is one word.
Yes.
That means this.
And the word, Jean, is asipatl, which I know will mean something to you. We've shared a relationship with a wonderful storyteller in Shetland who told us a story about a character called asipatl. So, for a little pig, which lying near the fire for warmth and being disturbed, patters among the ashes running across the hearth. That comes from a dictionary made by a scholar and joiner, a very well-respected scholar and a very well-respected joiner from the district of Nesting. So
that's just so marvelous.
It's so beautiful, isn't it?
It's beautiful.
The precision is poetic.
The precision, yes, and the way that the fact of having lived is encoded in the word itself. I mean, that's just in the language. That's so exciting. And I think, to answer your question, it's very strange how similar certain aspects of our projects are, even though they're so very different on the outside. But I think that part of what compelled, or to use Lydia Davis's word from last night, bothered me into writing this book was partly the terror of the evidence of my own memories disappearing. And it's quite literal, because there's this very old, falling down Faulknerian house that I now unfortunately own. And, you know, it really might fall or burn up or have somebody paint pentagrams all over it, you know, or whatever happens to an abandoned house. And yet it is so odd, because it's essentially a museum inside. It has not been really, what I say, which is maybe a little exaggeration, we've been forbidden to move the furniture since the Confederacy fell. That's probably not exactly true, but you know, that's part of the problem of the book. It's a metaphor for the problem. And so not only is the house this kind of diorama of history, and my grandfather's and his mother's and her father's and his father's history, and the history of people who were enslaved there, who still live in the area, and who the final chapter of the book is about the long-standing relationship between the two families, which is very unusual as well, and part of what the book reckons with. But on top of all of that history, which is incredibly precious to the African-American family as well, simply because it's so rare to have that kind of thing. My childhood took place there. So my father, who died when I was 2, grew up in that house. And you know, my memories of my grandfather are all in that house. So it's kind of like a full-scale mnemonic. You walk in there and it's like every single object you have all these memories of. So I think I was trying to create a kind of language to record that. And I think I do have just a terror of what's precious to so many people other than myself being just disappeared, you know.
And there was also such a strong sense of the preciousness of those childhood memories occurring there. I felt like I was following you around in a childhood state. And maybe I'm misremembering, is there a moment where you're allowed to look under the bed? There's something about a bed you were allowed to choose.
Oh, that's in a different house. Yes. Where all of my grandmothers, so my grandmother, who, if she introduced herself to you, she would have introduced herself as Emily Donaldson, Walton Ford, Chapman Jr. You know, so I don't know if that was really her name, but you know, that's how she would have introduced. And she had, she called herself, she was married to my grandfather, was the commandant. She was a Southern lady, and she had a sea of shoes.
Yes.
Which it's funny you bring that up, because I think I described them as a sea of photoluminescent plankton.
Yes.
Under the bed.
Maybe that's why it stuck.
Yeah. And, you know, I would go under there and try her shoes on. Yeah. Well, so I do have another question about poetry for you, which I think kind of relates to this question of extinction or fear, at least. I love, Jen has this chapter in here about vertigo, which I just think is brilliant. I also have vertigo, and she describes hiking, these incredible hikes that, do you remember the image? I think it was something like your sweet finger bones wilted and turned to water.
And turned to
like
water.
That.
You remember that very well. Yeah.
And yet you can't stop doing it, because it's just so incredible, everything that you're seeing. And you say, I was going to go on that hike and see if I could scare myself half to death into singing a song and turn it into a song.
And if not a song, a yodel. I guess I remember. It was more of a yelp, more of a desperate, unmusical yelp.
Yeah. So I think what that was making me wonder is whether you feel like there's a relationship between danger and poetry, or risk and poetry. And even, I doubt that you would see it like this because you've lived in Shetland for so long. And but I think for somebody reading the book for the first time, it might feel almost as if the whole project is a kind of danger, or simply moving to somewhere like Shetland, where you didn't know anybody in the first place, and that kind of thing. So I'm wondering about that correlation.
I think I moved to Shetland very glibly and in a state of complete innocence, but I think I tried to say in that essay that I was surprised by how many of my fears turned out to be crystallized in the place that I'd chosen to make my home. And I was speaking to my dear friend Jean earlier about my darling pirate, who some of you may have met at some point, who is a sailor. I'm terrified of the sea. I'm terrified of deep water. I hate being on boats. I get very seasick, and my partner is a sailor and a marine engineer, and the sea is where he feels most comfortable. So we have one of these sort of, that kind of opposites attract thing seems to have happened by some terrible accident. And I find myself very often in a state of extreme anxiety these days because we have a little boy who must grow up familiar and comfortable on the sea, or maybe not comfortable, but safely uncomfortable on the sea, because that's the safest way to be on the sea, is to be familiar with it, but never quite comfortable, I guess. And I do wonder about how this keeps happening in my life, that I'm driving myself out of my comfort zone continually. But your question was about poetry and whether that has something to do with danger. I think there's something about different states of consciousness that I want poetry to be able to hold on a page. And I'm always trying to escape my own control and my own intention. And yes, maybe my comfort place in poetry and in sensation. And that's partially because I know that I hamper myself with my own very, very, very limited comfort zone. I'm made anxious by very many things, but I also don't want that to limit my one life and my experience of it. So maybe that's why I'm pressing myself towards that brink all the time. And the vertigo is a funny thing. I mean, Shetland is almost completely encircled by horrifying cliffs. And I find myself continually, or I used before Robin arrived on the scene, I found myself taking myself to higher and higher cliffs. Whether there's a parallel for that in language, maybe. I think so. I've read your poems. Quite in awe. Do you think that's a thing for you in your poetry as well? Is there a risk thing happening?
I think so. I mean, I do relate to that that need to test the extreme case in order to, or sometimes the extreme is required to kind of like yank the song out of you, because a lyric is not a, staid little thing.
Yeah.
It requires real emotion, and maybe an accessible one is fear,
and often pressed out by a state of emergency.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder if we might. I can't believe how quickly this has gone, but we're almost there. Could you end us with a little bit on heaven?
Talking of extremity.
Yes.
So my book obsesses over the idea of remoteness. Shetland is described as remote almost continually. Oh gosh, have I lost it? Probably not. I really wanted to refute the idea that Shetland is a remote place. One, because it doesn't feel like that, and I know a lot of people in Shetland. Hardly any of them think they live in a remote place. It's so busy. It's really hard to feel remote when you live somewhere so busy. but also because I have an ideological concern that if we allow ourselves to be depicted as remote, perhaps we'll be more likely to be exploited, and that really does happen. And Shetland has seen very, very many booms of one sort or another. So I wanted to shift that, and then I started thinking, what if there's a problem with us always, with this history of depicting heaven as somewhere remote, somewhere inaccessible, somewhere way out there, which is, I realised, not the way that many people see heaven. And I mean here a pagan animist heaven, and a subjective one as well. What happens if it's closer to home, I wondered. And I got obsessed with the moon landings as well, writing about this book. The moon is very intimate to us in Shetland. I'll skip around a little bit so it doesn't take too long, I think. But Buzz Aldrin suffered from depression after he came back from the moon. Mike Collins, by his own account, felt fine. On his mantelpiece, he set a framed photograph of the crescent Earth taken from Apollo 11 and was tickled when visitors cried out, "Oh, the moon." He recommended rocketing world leaders into space so that they could see international conflicts in their galactic context. He had little desire to go back, though, turning down an opportunity to moonwalk himself on NASA's next moon mission. With every hour that passed in space, voyaging to the moon, orbiting it, getting everything ready for Aldrin and Armstrong's return, he spoke less about where he was and more about home. Collins had plenty more he wanted to do here on Earth below, and "I'm also planning to leave a lot of things undone," he said. But by and large he felt unchanged, except that he lost the habit of saying, "The sun comes up," or "the sun goes down." The Earth turns before the sun, he reminds us. We move into the sun's light, and we move into our own shadow. On his first space mission, he and Frank Young orbited the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour, but because they were traveling at the same speed as the Earth, they felt no sensation of speed whatsoever. Collins went outside. Has anyone ever been more utedex? That's a Shetland word. He stuck his head and shoulders out of the hatch and gazed at space, and as if looking at a garden from a porch. "My God," he exclaimed, "the stars are everywhere. This is the best view of the universe that a human has ever had. Today I am experiencing the best view of the universe that I have ever had." It is nearly December. It's the Sabbath for some, and I'm propped at zero velocity relative to the Earth in the porch of an old Shetland croft house called Northbanks on the Isle of Papastour, waiting as the Earth rolls me towards the sun. The wind comes on steady and without fatigue from the north, over the waves and over the black, still shadowed isles. In the traditional style, the byre is roofed with an old upside-down six-serene, caulked and tarred. It looks like an ark, and it's full of fuel, peats and pallets. Despite the wind and gloom, a wren is singing its heart out on the roof of the boat byre. John Donne, the writer and naturalist, says the wren is his favourite Shetland bird. It sings, he says, in the heart of winter. While I wait, I drink tea from an Alcatraz mug and munch digestives down into waning crescents, and I play with a trick of perspective. I look out and say to myself, what if this old Shetland garden, dim in the pre-dawn, this whirling epicentre of Hildy's colourful mosaics of broken pottery, of wind-bleached, wind-tousled grass, with this wren flitting from boat byre to broken bowl of rainwater to gatepost, is actually heaven. What if the answer to where am I is heaven? What if it has been right under our noses all along? Heaven on our doorstep, heaven under the kitchen sink. When we imagine some kind of membrane between us and heaven, I think we might be it. Sometimes a barrier, sometimes a portal. it might be ourselves that stand between ourselves and heaven. I know I'm not proposing anything new here. I'm just, like Collins, trying to see things from a different perspective. I'm just trying to wake up. At 8:38 a.m. on the porch of North Banks, I spin into the light. I think I'll leave it just there. I didn't describe Shetland. That's the place to stop.